Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at how to create our first .php file for our Apache Web Server from scratch. Now, this video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, client, and server-side scripting. And in particular, in this video, we are going to focus on the creation of a .php file as a default page for our Apache Web Server. Now, this video assumes that you've watched some of the earlier videos on how to set up and configure your Apache Web Server to run with PHP. Not really going to be covering too much at that in this video, although we'll be taking a look at the configuration file briefly. But if you have any questions, probably want to go back and take a look at one of the earlier videos, depending on which environment you are on. Now, again, for this video, we are going to be focusing on a Windows installation of Apache, so some of the paths and everything like that might be a little bit different. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our favorite IDE. In this case, I'm using Visual Studio, but there's nothing magic about it. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file. Now, in this case, I have a PHP editor installed. Again, this might be a little bit different for Visual Studio, VS Code, Notepad++, NetBeans. Again, there's so many different opportunities here for different environments that I really encourage you to branch out and explore what's out there. If anything, Visual Studio is probably a little bit of an ad hoc solution, with this being more of a plugin style architecture. Now, in this case, we have our PHP script that we're going to choose. So you go ahead and select open, and you'll see that it's pretty basic script. In other words, all that we have here is the open and close PHP tags. We'll talk a little bit more about those in other videos and other documentation. But again, this is just a bare bones script here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a keyword in PHP called echo. And echo, essentially all it does is it takes whatever you have in double or single quotes, and it simply sends it to the client via the Apache Web Server. In other words, when the Apache Web Server is requested a resource and it identifies it as a PHP resource, then the Apache Web Server uses PHP. In other words, it runs PHP on the server, and whatever commands are in this PHP file then simply result in output that gets streamed back to the client. In this case, what we want to do is we want to echo some message. You can sort of think of this as the hello world of PHP. And in that end, what we're going to do is we're going to put something silly again, like welcome from PHP. And again, what you put there doesn't really matter too much. I'm sort of just keeping it in line with some of the earlier videos. Again, like I said, this is our equivalent of our hello world. And we go ahead and follow this up then with a semicolon. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to be very careful about where I save it and what I call it. Now, again, I'm on a Windows machine with Apache, so I'm using my htdocs folder as my location or my repository for my base website. You can get fancy and have subfolders and different paths and all that. We're not going to do that in this video. Instead, we're simply going to call this one index.php. And we're going to go ahead and save it. And then we're going to go out to the file system. Excuse me. In other words, we're going to go to our File Explorer, and you'll see that now I have an index.php. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do this wrong the first time. In other words, I'm going to come out here to my index.php, just like I did with my index.html, and I'm going to attempt to double click it or open it. As a matter of fact, you can see what my options are here. I'm going to force it to open with Google Chrome. And you'll see that I have, well, let's just say not the results I expected. I mean, technically, I'm displaying the results of that .php file, but that isn't what we had in mind. Instead, what we want to do is we actually want it to display it as HTML. In other words, we want to prove that the server is serving up this file. Right now, we just simply have a file on the file system that we're using whatever application it is to open it. We could just as soon use Notepad. So that's not really what we want to do. Instead, what we want to do is we want to go to, in this case, Chrome, your favorite web browser, whatever you happen to be using, and we want to follow this up with a 127.0.0.1. And we hit enter, and you'll see it says, welcome to HTML. And again, probably not what you were expecting. And again, the reason for that is because if we take a look at how we configured our web server, particularly when we were looking at the configuration file in our earlier video. In other words, if you come here to the conf folder, I'm going to go ahead and go back to Visual Studio, and I'm going to open up my httpd.conf, and I'm going to find where I referenced my index.html. And you'll notice from the earlier video, we went ahead and added index.php, but you'll notice the order in which it's searching for those files. So in other words, if you go just simply to the default address, in other words, the base root, if you would, of your web server, the 127.0.0.1, the web server, instead of displaying the directory like we saw in the earlier video, is going to look for index.html, index.php, and so on in that order. Now, what we can do is we can simply come here to the configuration file. We can rearrange the order. In this case, we're going to put our index.php first. We're going to save that configuration file. And as we talked about in the earlier videos, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to stop and then start your web server again. And if we come back over here to our browser and we simply refresh, then we do in fact get welcome from PHP. So in other words, basically as it was going through the default files, it saw the index.php first, and it simply went ahead and served up that .php file. Now, there's a couple of things going on here and a couple of variants that we want to explore, but before we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look at the code behind. In other words, we're going to take a look at what was actually served by the web server to the web client. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're simply going to use the hotkey Control-U, and you can see that it only has welcome from PHP. Now, technically, your web browser can display a lot of things. These newer web browsers in particular are incredibly robust, but it's not really well-formed HTML. In other words, all we're doing is we're streaming the characters W, E, L, and so on for the message welcome from PHP. Now, I'm going to take a look in a later video about how to fix this, but I want you to make a quick note of what the echo command does. It simply sends whatever text we put in the double quotes. In other words, if we come back over here to our index.php, it simply sends that to the client. Now, one other thing before we leave this, we want to take a look at some alternatives to constantly modifying this httpd.conf. In other words, let's just say that we want to go back to the original scenario where we had index.html as the first option, followed by index.php. I'm going to go ahead and save the .conf file. I'm going to come out here. I'm going to go ahead and stop my httpd daemon, and I'm going to restart it one more time. And then I'm going to go over to my web browser. We can close the source at this point. I'm going to refresh. You'll notice that I'm back to my welcome from HTML. What I can do, instead of relying on the default page that is going to be pulled, I can simply specify then the index.php in the address. So in other words, what we have here is index.php, and you can see now I'm forcing the Apache Web Server to serve or deliver that particular file. So we can have now the ability to serve both a default index.html as well as specifically serve up an index.php, or for that matter, whatever other PHP pages you would be interested in. And we can do the same thing now. If you want to, again, launch a tab in your browser, we can do the same thing or force this by simply specifying index.html. And again, it'll specifically pull up that page. So hopefully now you see the relationship between the configuration file and what gets launched by default, as well as the ability to support .html and .php files. So as you can tell, I believe I have got one of my cats behind here telling me that this video is now officially too long. And so I'm going to see if I can't stop here. If you have any questions, comments or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.